All right, cool. Thank you so much for making time. I really appreciate you chatting with me today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Yeah, of course. What drew you to music and games as a subject matter? Like, how did you make your way there?
I got into making games pretty early on. I was in my early teens. There's this software called RPG Maker,
Mm-hmm.
and that was making some games with that. And eventually, I always had music and melodies in my head, and I wanted to manifest them and put them into the games that I was making. And that's how I got into music production. I also had some piano lessons as a kid, which I was not a big fan of, but music production was really fun for me to the point that I got so deep into it that I abandoned making games
Okay.
for some years.
Oh
But
man.
eventually I got back into game development, and ever since I've been combining the two, music and games.
Was there like a particular moment for you that like, oh, this is the aspect of games? Because there are so many different ways into it, architecture, design, narrative, like music, as we'll talk about, is one of these areas that maybe doesn't get as much love as it obviously should. Yeah, was there a game moment for you that's, there's something really interesting happening here with games?
With games and music,
Yeah.
or
Yeah, yeah.
specific? Yeah. Yes, I definitely had a moment like that. It was in, I think, 2014. I was playing a game called Fracked OSC. And yeah, I'm generally a big adventure games fan, and Myst games were a big influence for me. And so that was basically Myst, but it was also sound and music because you explore the synthesizer world, and all your actions in the game, they're somehow reflected in the sounds that you can hear.
Yeah.
Yeah, that really fascinated me to the point that was actually the point that got me thinking, and that made me want to actually make my own games again.
That's really interesting. I think for me, I like Super Mario World many years ago, many moons ago. I remember playing that game and being like really enamored with the sound and then some of the sound. I know that the reason I bring this up is because there is many years later I interviewed like Koji Kondo, and I did not know that there's an extra when you get on Yoshi. There's an extra little beat of syncopation, and it's this like marker for you that you are like a little like a audio marker for you to engage with the world in that particular way, even though the sound is not in the same way as it impact the gameplay in a really dynamic way. But that was just like one of these things for me that I was like, oh yeah, sound like really pulls me through a lot of experiences. How did you and Gabriel come to work on this particular project? What was like the origin story there?
I got into I'm at Concordia University in Montreal, and my research topic is using games to affect emotion, and through that also to affect behavior. The idea is to help players make progress in the game, but in a way that they might not actually necessarily realize.
Okay.
And so my thought was to use music for that. And I explored these interactions with music and sound. And Gabrielle at the time was not yet my supervisor, but then
Okay.
one of my other supervisors said, "Hey, there's this music person who's also dealing with things like AI and like interactive media and all of that." And we got talking, and it was a good match. Yeah,
Yeah.
sense of working together. Yeah.
Yeah. No, that's really cool. It sounds like also like they're interdisciplinary, which I'm sure is like helpful for you, like thinking
Yeah.
about games in that context versus the kind of thing that might come out of more games. If you were the sound person in a games focus or game studies program, like having someone like having an advisor that's like thinking about games across a variety of media, I'm sure is like helpful in some way.
Yeah, that's true. Because like my other supervisors, they're more rooted in like more specifically music.
Yeah.
Yeah. So then they might not be like very familiar with maybe the games aspect. And since he works more at the intersection of more like interactivity, he's not necessarily a games like his background is not in games, but it's
Okay.
more computation arts in general. But it still made sense for us to work together because interactivity is, I would say, maybe what we have in common in that sense.
Yeah. Well, jumping into the paper more specifically, the paper documents 43 titles. Is that right? In terms of the total number?
I think, yeah.
All things considered, given the long history of games, it seems like a pretty thin slice. And I was curious what do you think explains that scarcity? Is it like a design problem? Is it a market problem? Or is it like something more fundamental about what it is that we're looking for when we play games?
So I think that there's actually many things that figure into that. First of all, since you mentioned the number 43 games, it's not that there's only 43 such
Right.
games
Sorry.
in the
Yeah.
world. It's more that, I mean, this is maybe more of a curated selection. For example, what reduces this number is things like there are many sound-led games that are essentially the same in terms of gameplay. We have, I don't know, 5, 6, 7 Guitar Hero games, and
Right.
we counted only one of those, for example. So, the selection focused more on landmark titles, and we try to make sure to have a variety in there. But when it comes to actually finding these games, like, that's one issue. It's actually quite tricky because there seems to be not that big of an awareness of this type of mechanic, where the music and the sound is the leading element beyond music games. So if you actually want to find a game, like I talked about before, Fract OSC, which counts as a first-person 3D adventure game, you might not find it under the music games category,
Right.
and you don't find it under the rhythm games category. There's another good example. It's called Unheard, and it's this game where there's a crime that takes place, and you basically try to trace back what happened by listening to an audio recording that shows what transpired there. So you listen to conversations, you listen to maybe sounds that happen. But again, if you want to find this game, there's no category in it. If you go on Steam, yeah, there's a category for rhythm games, but there's no category for sound-focused games. There's not even a common term that people would use to address that. I think even if you were looking for it, perhaps you wouldn't necessarily even know where to start.
So it sounds like it's a combination. I guess to start there, because I think that the things that you're describing are more like market and discoverability, like how do you find an audience or how does that get communicated? Is there anything that you feel like is preventing this avenue for games developing a more, like from a design perspective? So if I'm a designer and I want to make a game like Fract or Hohokum or any game that uses music in a really novel or interesting way, are there barriers to using music in that way if you're just like a designer that wants to express that feeling to players?
There definitely are. As a game developer myself, I've experienced that. And so there are technical barriers, for example. Whenever you want to implement sound in a way where timing is important, it's like with sound, it's very important to have the right timing. We will perceive that if it's off by some too many milliseconds, you will notice the delay there. Common game engines, for the longest time, did not have anything built in that we could use to develop these interactions. And to give you an example, I've been a Unity developer for a decade. And the reason to switch over to Unreal is that I think it was in 2022 or 23, they released the system called MetaSounds. And this was the first time that you had a system that allows you to develop anything sound related, digital signal processing related, but that's integrated with the engine. Okay. And now with that, it's very easy actually to connect game actions to the sound engine. And if you look at something like Fract OSC, the way the sound was implemented there was using a system called Pure Data.
Okay.
Which is it's a digital signal processing system. It's been around for ages. It allows you to create your own synthesizers and musical instruments and all of that. And what they did is they essentially offloaded all of the sound of the game to this system. So even in terms of what's called spatialization, so when you turn around and the sounds are also, they seem to come from the direction that you can see they're coming from, right? Even that, they did all of that with Pure Data. But the problem is when you use external systems like that and you want to deploy that on different devices, then you'd have to deal with that. I tried using pure data, and there's a lot of technical stuff you'd have to deal with when you want to integrate it with an engine, a game engine. Yeah.
So it sounds like, because before just you had the team or the discipline or the determination to really do something, and now it's much more, the avenue sounds like it's much more open to game makers in a way that just hasn't been through the history of games. Is that right?
Yeah, at least if you look at Unreal, definitely the case. Although I heard of some other frameworks and technologies that might be now easier to implement. But even still, if we look at the games landscape, it's not like there has been an extreme influx of sound-led games in the past, let's say 5 years or so. Yeah, if anything, the golden era of music games, that was like in the mid 2000s when we had all the plastic guitars with Guitar Hero and Rock Band.
Do you feel like that moment, obviously there was an extent of the popularity of those types of games in the late 2000s. Do you feel like that kind of correction maybe set music games back in some ways, even if you're doing something entirely different? Some of that baggage from that era maybe carries over.
I'm not sure, because it seems like these games are not necessarily perceived in that context.
Okay.
As I mentioned before, you wouldn't find the actually interesting game examples or the more innovative game examples. You wouldn't find them easily because there's no categorization for them.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
I want to talk about, speaking of Rock Band, I do want to talk about peripherals. We've got the guitar controller, Guitar Hero, dance pad, and DDR. The shape of the object seems to drive the music experience like as much as the sound itself. How do you think about the relationship between the physical form, like what you hold, which is so important for players, and the engagement with sound in game?
I think that the relationship between movement and sound in games and outside of games is very important to look at. And it's actually something that we perceive very intuitively, right? If we think about listening to music and how we sometimes just automatically start to nod our head with the beats that we hear, or going dancing. People know how to move. They figure it out. It's not a difficult thing to go dance. I'm not talking about dancing the waltz or anything, but when people go, let's say, to an electronic music party, they know how to move. So there is some quality in the music quite literally moves us.
Yeah, it's definitely like a good point about like we do have this like native reaction, the visceral reaction to the music that is really different. Like in games, I don't necessarily have an attendant bodily reaction to like visual inputs. Like when I see something, I don't think I interpret that. My body does not interpret that in a particular way, unless it's like gross, right? That might be something that triggers like a physical response. But music by definition just encourages like a type of engagement. Do you feel like the peripherals side of things, do you feel like that is it a prerequisite for these types of games? I guess in theory you can play Guitar Hero on a controller. So yeah, I'm just curious whether or not, what does the peripheral like add from the experience? Maybe what does it obscure as well?
If we think about the plastic guitars, there's a certain way to hold it, right? So I'm already like in a certain position with my body, and that already constrains how I move. But if we look at maybe more recent examples, something like Beat Saber and other VR rhythm games, we have a lot more freedom, right? We have the two sticks that we hold, and then that gives us actually quite a lot of freedom and of movement. But I feel like in that case, it's not just the peripheral itself. And of course, something like the dance mat of Dance Revolution also has very specific movements that it encourages. But it's not just the peripheral itself, it's also the gameplay, right? Because when you play something like Beat Saber, you have a certain type of movement that you do. They have the slashing of the boxes. And if you played some other game that has some other gameplay, then maybe a boxing game, maybe you would move your hands differently. There's lots of VR rhythm shooters also, where again, you have other movements than the slashing of Beat Saber. So it's both the peripherals, but also the gameplay that you're dealing with.
Yeah, 100%. I don't know necessarily. It's interesting with certain types of games. Was it Donkey Kong? What's the name of that game? The DK Bongos. There was like a Nintendo
Donkey
64
Kong
game.
guy, yeah.
Having that invitation is really important. Let's go through some of the modes of listening. You talk me through the three different modes and like how they map onto game design. And what does it feel like to play a game that demands like each one? So walk me through what are the three modes and what are those feelings that come from each one of those modes?
Okay, so yeah, so the listening modes, they actually come from movies originally, or from movie sound theory. But yeah, they're very much applicable also with games. And so essentially we have three different listening modes. We have causal listening, we have codal listening, and reduced listening. And so with causal listening, that deals with identifying the source of a sound. So you hear something, maybe a person talking or some object producing a sound, and you're trying to understand, well, its origin, especially when you cannot see it. And that's why something like spatialization is very important in games, so that you can actually hear, oh, is the sound coming from the left? Is it coming from the right? Thinking of a game like Blind Drive, where you're driving a car in this game, but you don't actually see it. It's a sound-only game. And based on where the sounds are coming from, you have to evade them. So if you can hear a car in front of you, you have to maybe move left or right. And so that is the causal listening. So where is it coming from, essentially? Then we have codal listening, and that involves essentially the process of making a sense of what we hear or deriving meaning from a sound. And that often happens based on a set of learned rules and conventions. Language is actually a very prominent example for codal listening. We hear sounds, and based on the rules, based on what we know, we decode that. And then there's reduced listening, and that focuses on listening to the sound itself and to its qualities. That also entails things like anticipating certain sounds. So let's say we're listening to a piece of music or we're playing Guitar Hero, but the music has a beat, and as I play it, I can anticipate certain moments in the music as I listen to it. So reduced listening is something that we do a lot, especially in rhythm games.
I mean, it's interesting you mentioned like that aspect of reduced listening is that really focused listening. It's pretty rare, right? In games, it doesn't happen all that often. To the Broad, which is the Modern Art Museum here in Los Angeles, for this Robert Therian exhibition. And they had these two contemporary composers, Sarah Davachi and Robert Takahashi Novak. And for Sarah Davachi's work, it was basically two trombones like in this space, like, you know, 300 people, these two trombones just like walking through the space and kind of like phasing the trombones. They were going in and out. The performance was like 45 minutes long. And it was such a like active experience for me to really sit and meditate and think, to just really be alone with my thoughts in that way. It's not an experience that you find in games all that often. Sometimes it does seem like sound, in the modes that you described is often much more transactional. Could you tell me maybe just a little bit about, I don't know, like why we don't see that maybe more in games? Or just tell me about, what maybe some of the barriers of having that type of meditative experience with sound in games, why we don't see more of that.
I would say that to enable this form of listening, a game would have to be very much catered to that, because in a game, there's a lot going on, and there can be a very lush and dense soundscape. Thinking about an online shooter, something like Battlefield, you hear shooting, you hear explosions and all of that. And it's important to listen. It's important to understand, what is that sound? Who is shooting? And also, where is it coming from? So the causal listening to understand my enemy is like here or there, and I need to act in a certain way. But with reduced listening, I'm not going to just stand still and just listen to my environment because I don't think I will be very successful in an action game like that. And so for reduced listening to happen, the game environment would have to really be catered to that. Have
Right.
to be made in mind with people actually taking a moment and hearing things. That is quite rare.
Yeah, on both sides. It's the actor face on the part of the designer that this is something that people would be interested in, and then is like an act of patience on the part of the player to know what it is. I do think this like question of expectations does come up quite a bit in like lots of like other media. I'm thinking like in film, like Kelly Reichardt, the director, makes these very slow, meditative films. But I know what I'm getting into with a Kelly Reichardt film. There's an expectation there. And I think sometimes it can be hard for players to maybe get into that mindset before they sit down and do something like that if they were expecting something else. Yeah.
Yeah. And if I might add, there's also the aspect of, I think our world and games are often very fast paced. And so there's not necessarily space to slow down like that. And I love movies, but I'm not a big expert. But I would dare to say that probably some of the most successful movies that made the most money might be the ones that don't necessarily facilitate like very slow and contemplative experiences. And I can see how that is also reflected in games, because if we look at successful ones, yeah, most of the time it's not something where reduced listening and slowing down is always, the center of the gameplay.
Although I guess that would be an encouragement. Like when we think about experimentation in game design, like maybe that is a place where we think about it being interactivity, like creating new game mechanics or that type of thing, or telling new stories. New and novel interactions with sound through music feels pretty experimental to me. Maybe we'll see more of that at some point. Are there any non-game contexts, sound art, installation work, that point to like maybe where games could go along those lines? If you're a game designer, that's maybe my people are not necessarily in the world of games for the reasons that you outlined. Maybe they exist in other media. Yeah, are there non-game contexts that maybe could serve as a signpost for someone who is making games and trying to, and vice versa, for people who enjoy those types of experiences, that they could be looking for these types of things in games?
Yeah, definitely. And I would say that it's pretty much necessary to look at these contexts because, there's not that big of a variety in terms of interaction with music and sound. And we can definitely draw inspiration from maybe adjacent or relevant fields. So what I often look at is research in electroacoustics and any practices in that context. So, for example, there was Murray Schafer. So Murray Schafer popularized this idea of the soundscape, and he investigated, and his colleagues, they investigated the sounds of the world and also how soundscapes changed throughout history. What I find very interesting in that approach was that it was very, you could say, a holistic view on sound that looked at all aspects of society that might have led to changes in what we hear around us. And so one of the main things he said was that essentially our world is getting more and more filled with noise. And he made this distinction between hi-fi and lo-fi sound.
Okay.
Lo-fi is essentially you're walking downtown and you hear the cars, you hear radio, you hear all sorts of sound happening around you, like many people talking and all of that. And hi-fi sound would be something like you're in a quiet village and you hear a church bell ring. And one of the practices that he and his group did was soundwalks. And that a soundwalk is basically you take a walk, but you do that with a strong focus on what you can actually hear. And there are also many other different exercises that come from that field that we can look at and that might help us. Yeah, many like different exercises that deal with probably a lot of what we would maybe find in in the field of mindfulness, perhaps, because it often entails this idea of slowing down and listening to your environment and becoming aware of the things around you. There is a book actually by Murray Schafer that's called something like 100 Sound Exercises. And it is 100 different exercises of how you can perceive sound. There is also a publication by Pauline Oliveros, Deep Listening. So yeah, deep listening also as a process to engage with your sonic environment. So yeah, looking at that can definitely help develop new forms of gameplay.
It's interesting. I spoke to Florence Smith Nichols earlier. They're a game researcher that focuses on anthropology. They were an urban anthropologist. And one of the things that they were saying was how you as a game player can approach games through an anthropological lens, like either by leaving your own traces in a particular world or also creating your own detritus, like collecting objects. There's a way that you can approach games that are not explicitly anthropological games, but you can, as a player, do things in an anthropological manner. And it occurs to me that sound seems like one of these ways that you can have deep listening engagements with games that maybe even weren't even designed to be in that way. And that might encourage a kind of like contemplation or appreciation, even if that's not entirely intended. So it is interesting. Like, I think we could have some practices or approach games. We approach them so often, like through the interactive systems or through their visuals or through their story, and just in sitting with a game and thinking and reflecting on like what you're actually like listening to in a contemplative way, I think could be a really interesting way to kind of, it just occurred to me. I'm like, oh yeah, that'd be like, there are games that I love that maybe I should spend less time trying to do things and just actually just sit and walk and just see what happens and see what I pick up along the way. Yeah.
Some games, there feature such intricate environments that we can definitely do that. We can just take a walk in the game. This is something that I love doing, for example, with something like Red Dead Redemption 2. There are whole ecologies implemented in that game. They took a lot of care in what kinds of birds you can hear, for example, depending on where you are in the environment, and what kind of plants you come across and all of that. So this is definitely an environment that would allow for that. You could do a sound walk in Red Dead Redemption. You could treat it more as this, an ambient experience. Yeah. And I think what's very interesting in this is that if we think about soundscapes as music, maybe, and we can also think about games as also in a sense of music, because we have all these different individual elements. We have NPCs, they go about their day. You have a day-night cycle, maybe, that also affects what you can hear in the world. And they're almost like tracks or layers in a piece of music that keep constantly changing and evolving. There's this idea of generative music, this idea of music that is ever evolving. And he got into that by wrapping magnetic tape around chairs and things and having different tapes at different lengths with different musical elements, and that would overlap at different times. And that's how he made music for airports, for example. And you could see a game in the same way, where every object has its own rhythm and how they overlap and also generate this generative piece that we can see, but that we can also hear.
Yeah. Last question I have for you is, based on the work, and you've done this big survey, is there a game that doesn't exist yet that maybe expresses some of the things that you would like to see as far as sound that goes in game?
A game that doesn't exist yet. I don't want to turn this into a shameless plug or anything, but it is part of my research.
Okay. Yeah, sure.
Yeah. It probably does not solve all the questions. I developed a game, for example, it's called Soundgarden, and it's actually very much based on all of these things that we talked about, and it's rooted in Murray Schafer's idea of the acoustic ecologies and thinking about interaction with sound that, go beyond maybe what we usually deal with. And I'm very sure that there are probably many other independent game makers out there who might not have a big marketing budget, but if we maybe scroll through itch.io and try to find these things, I have a feeling that we'll find some things there. So I think some of these games perhaps were already made. We just need to find them.
Yeah. Vadim, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it. It was really great talking to you, and certainly offers a lot for me. No games are ever silent. It definitely encourages me to spend a little bit more time just like sitting and listening instead of actively trying to move forward, pressing buttons and get on my way. So thank you for your time.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.
Cool.